I propose to take questions 5 to 16 together, as they almost exclusively relate to my recent visit to Africa.
Again, well, there's two groupings here. One is the Africa visits, and the other one is the Taoiseach's proposed visits for the next 6 months. They're quite different. But anyway.
What do we think?
5 to 16.
Okay. The deputy is correct. The deputy is correct. So I'll raise that with my office when I get back. There are 16 questions. There are 12 questions here, and you could roughly break them into two groups: one about Africa, which is in the past, and others about future meetings, which is in the future.
Be concise. We should be able to get through more.
I take the deputy's point of order on that matter. I travelled to Mali and Ethiopia from the 6th to the 11th of January to see at first hand the work being done by our defence forces, by Irish Aid, and by our diplomatic and other representatives on the ground in both countries. My visit also led me to get the perspective of African leaders on Ireland's contribution to the deepening partnership between Africa and Europe, which focused on sustainable development, peace and security, trade, economic growth and job creation. In Mali, I met with the President and discussed the peace and security challenges facing his country as the government seeks to regain control of Mali, and how UN and EU missions can help them to do that. He thanked me very strongly for Ireland's contribution to the EU training mission. I met the mission commander of the EU training mission, Brigadier General Miro, and accompanied Minister Keogh, and was accompanied by Minister Keogh and the Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces and the Secretary General of the Department of Defence. I also visited the EUTM training camp in Kudikuro, where Irish troops are training the Malian armed forces. In Ethiopia, I had meetings with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and President Sahle-Work Zewde and the African Union Acting Chair, Commissioner El Fadil. The Prime Minister and I discussed his programme of reform, including improving the conditions for foreign direct investment and economic growth in his country, where Irish experience and expertise may be useful. My discussions with the President also focused on the need to drive economic development in the country, including through advancements of education, especially education of girls. In my meeting with Commissioner El Fadil of the African Union, we discussed how the European Union and Africa can work together on combating our shared challenges. In Addis, I met Irish NGOs working in Ethiopia, including Goal Concern, Trokra, Self-Help and Vita, and I also attended a community reception at the Irish Embassy, where I launched the ETO Alumni Irish Network. I visited several heritage sites, including the UNESCO World Heritage Site at Lalibela, where I launched a new partnership initiative on cultural heritage and rural job creation. I also announced the greening of the iconic Church of St George for the first time on St Patrick's Day. I visited Irish aid-funded projects in Tigray, where Irish funding is improving the lives of some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. And finally, I visited a UNHCR camp close to the Eritrean border, which is home to 18,000 refugees. 1 in 7 refugees in the camp are unaccompanied minors, and I saw the work being done to ensure that children in these camps can continue their education. As regards my travel intentions for the coming 6 months, later in January, I expect to travel to Davos for the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. I also plan to attend scheduled meetings of the European Council, 21st, 22nd of March, and 21st to 21st of June, as well as an informal meeting in Sibiu in Romania on the 9th of May. Other EU engagements may also arise, and I'll give full consideration to attendance in due course. I also look forward to travelling to the United States in March for the annual St Patrick's Day celebrations. The details of this visit are still under consideration, and I'll provide further information in due course. Other international visits and engagements with political leaders are also being given consideration, but none are confirmed at present.
Deputy Howlin.
Can I, at the outset, say I warmly welcome the Taoiseach's visit to Africa. I think that it's an important statement of Ireland's support for the development agenda, but also is in keeping with a very strong record of, if you like, non-partisan, non-aligned development and promotion there, and I welcome that. I raised, the Taoiseach would recall, on many occasions the need for what is called a new Marshall Plan, or a new development plan for Africa, but also for our own neighbourhood in the Middle East, in neighbouring countries. We are going to be faced with growing pressure because of climate change, because of population increase, in terms of stress on migration into the European continent, radicalisation in those countries themselves, which might in the future present security threats to us, and also the contamination, bluntly, of European politics, where we've seen, and it's right across the continent now, more and more fundamentalist type parties with a narrow nationalist agenda, with a xenophobia agenda, gaining traction and gaining ground. And I think the main way of tackling this is to have a new Marshall Plan that we can devote very significant resources as a continent to developing the economies of countries that need not only mitigation of climate change impact, but real development. And I think Ireland could be a leader in that regard. I'd welcome the Taoiseach's comment on that. And I think that should be one of the cornerstone propositions that Ireland makes as part of its Security Council bid. I also welcome the Taoiseach's general view of increasing Ireland's footprint. And I'd ask him just to maybe spell out in clearer detail how broadening Ireland's international footprint might be achieved, and how he would envisage, both in terms of formal representations, but also bilateral visits, that we could put, if you like, a stronger vision and understanding of Ireland, our history and our record and our future on the record for other nations.
Martin.
I also warmly welcome the visit to Mali and to Ethiopia, given, and as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, been to Ethiopia and have witnessed at first hand the very impactful work of Irish aid, and particularly in terms of across Africa, in terms of educational attainment, in terms of health, and in Ethiopia in particular, some very good health projects funded by Irish aid, and indeed agricultural projects as well, in terms of the agricultural practices and so on. And I think in particular, you met with the Irish Defence Forces, Taoiseach, who are playing an essential part in helping to train the Mali Army to deal with their challenges. But I think it does highlight and illustrate the contribution that the Irish Army and Defence Forces generally make to the international reputation of Ireland. And in some respects, that's not reflected, in my view, here at home, in terms of government policy and attitude and demeanour to the Defence Forces. I think it's, the figures last November showed that Defence Forces are down to 9,022. It has an establishment strength, an approved establishment strength of 9,500, but it hasn't reached that for 7 years. There is an enormous retention crisis in our Defence Forces. I met recently with RACO, and for example, they're losing expertise across the board in communications, sometimes to other government agencies and departments who can pay far more for the same people, but because of different norms and so on. The Army Bomb Disposal Unit, for example, last year, the year before, was significantly undermined by people leaving. So I think, and I know this wasn't the intention, but the Army is not about photo opportunities. I think when we see the great work that they're doing, we do need to seriously analyse the degree to which the crisis and retention and the lack of morale within the Defence Forces at the moment is being dealt with in terms of official government policy. So it is a big worry, the loss of expertise and experience on an ongoing basis. I think you accept that there are issues within the Defence Forces, Taoiseach, and could you indicate when you expect the awaited report on Defence Forces from the Public Sector Pay Commission?
Barrett.
One question I have for you, Taoiseach, is did you discuss in any of your meetings while you were in Africa, did you discuss what's going on in Sudan? There is basically a popular revolution going on against the al-Bashir government in Sudan, triggered by a very ruthless, brutal, murderous response by the al-Bashir regime to protest over bread price increases. and now there's been mass arrests of students, closing down schools, universities and so on, and 24 people killed, and yet the protests continue, which show you how serious they are, and the vast mobilisation of the poor and working people. And I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on that. But the al-Bashir regime is in receipt of EU money, is part of this setup where Europe pays African nations to keep people out of Europe, and is that why they're being so silent on what is a popular revolution being brutally attacked by the Sudanese government? But also I want to ask, I mean, I have absolutely no doubt about the bravery, commitment and determination of the Irish Defence Forces, those involved in the training mission in Mali, and indeed the Rangers that might be deployed there. But I have very serious questions about whether they should be there and whether you should be sending them there. This is a counter-terrorism operation. This isn't peacekeeping, okay? This is a dangerous mission in a very, very messy conflict where there's no real good guys. The Mali government have even acknowledged themselves that they've killed innocent civilians in their counter-terrorism operations. There's ethnic complexities. The French have a colonial history and an agenda there, where our deployment, I think, really potentially causes very potentially serious, very reputational damage to Ireland's high standing as, if you like, a neutral country that doesn't back or side with imperial powers, big powers, in a very, very messy situation. So maybe you could comment on that as well, Taoiseach.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. And of course, the reason why there is such a retention and recruitment crisis in the Defence Forces is, frankly, because people can't live on the poverty wages that they're being paid. And not just members of the Defence Forces, but more directly, their families have, as we all now know, they have long protested and campaigned on that issue. And it is a disgrace to us as an Oireachtas if we praise the blue helmets and we praise our peacekeepers and bask in their reflected glory, and then when they return home, pay them poverty wages, and that needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Taoiseach, the Taoiseach has been in the Middle East a number of times since becoming Minister for Foreign Affairs. I was in Palestine and the West Bank myself just before Christmas. I visited extensively. I met with a wide range of groups, individuals, met with each of the political parties or factions on the Palestinian side, saw it firsthand, the outrage and the breach of international law that the illegal settlements represented, spoke to families, to children, to young people who at first hand experienced day and daily the harassment and brutalisation at the hands of the Israeli Defence Forces, reflected on the fact that Oslo, it seems now, might be dead, despaired at the fact that the international community sits on its hands and allows the Israeli state to act with absolute impunity, reflected on the fact that there is actually an answer to all of this, that there is, if the international community were so minded, still one last chance to deliver a two-state solution. And then wonder and ask you today, will you visit Palestine? I think it would be extremely important that you would. Furthermore, can you as government move to recognition of the state of Palestine as mandated by this Oireachtas? And when the Occupied Territories Bill comes before us in the Dáil, will you please change position and will you do the right thing, the thing that's in accordance with the spirit and letter of international law, and support that legislation?
Thanks. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that all deputies welcomed my visit to Africa, and it was a real privilege to have the opportunity to visit Africa to represent the country there. And it's the first official visit by a Taoiseach, I believe, in more than 10 years. And it reflects our increasing and deepening engagement with Africa through the European Union and the UN, bilaterally, through our defence forces, that's the security aspect of it, through international development, and the budget for international development will increase by over 100 million this year, through our membership of the African Development Bank, and the fact that we've recently become observers of La Francophonie. We're also upgrading diplomatic missions. The Liberia office has been upgraded to an embassy, and we're examining whether we should open a new mission in Francophone West Africa. And I have to say I very much agree with Deputy Howlin's assessment about having a Marshall Plan for Africa. Whether we choose to call it that or not is a different matter, but the concept is the correct one, I believe. That approach taken by America to rebuilding Western Europe, rebuilding the economies, making sure that there are democratic institutions that worked, making sure that there was security. And if I think about many of the major problems that we now face in Europe, whether it's human trafficking and illegal migration, whether it's terrorism, whether it's drug trafficking, whether it's climate change, all of those are problems that either have origins or sources in other parts of the world, including parts of Africa. And if the West and Western countries spent as much as they do on military operations in places like Syria as they did on international development and genuine security operations in Africa, we wouldn't have half the problems that are causing populists to be on the rise in Europe at the moment. In terms of the defence forces, the budget for this year provides for an increase of just over 50 billion euros. I can assure the Deputy that this is not for photo ops. The extra 50 billion euros for the defence forces this year is for aircraft, for vessels, for equipment, for improvements to barracks, and also increases in pay and also for pensions. I think joining the defence forces is a very good career option. You can join at 18 or 19, within 2.5 years become a 3-star private, be paid 35,000 euros a year at a time when many of your peers would be on SUSI grants or still in college, and you can also get new skills, represent your country and travel the world. And I think it is a career option that young people might consider, particularly if they don't want to go to college or they don't want to go down the apprenticeship route. But I acknowledge that pay is an issue, and we need to do something about it. So the first thing, of course, is the public sector pay deal that will provide already for further pay increases this year, and a special increase for new entrants in March, provided we can finalise agreement with ICTU on that. And that will be very significant for the Defence Forces because so many have been recruited since 2012. And then there is also the work of the Public Sector Pay Commission. We expect that to report in March or April. And they're particularly looking at the issue of specialists, the fact that pilots, air traffic controllers, engineers, many others now have such good opportunities in the private sector that we are losing them from the Defence Forces. We're also now allow people to return to the Defence Forces, and that's really good to see people coming back who have left. They weren't able to do that before. And also the Pay Commission is going to look at some allowances that are specific to the Defence Forces, reflecting the very specific type of work they do. And I look forward to that report being received in March or April.